Why have humanity's greatest achievements happened during wartime?
Well, I would say maybe technology, but also there can be profound economic growth uh, because it's about survival. If you don't find a solution to whatever problem you have, then you don't win the war. And so the resources that you're willing to commit for the sake of winning the war, for the sake of solving a problem, for this, there's no other um, motivation that's more powerful than the need to survive.
Is war or peace our default state as human beings?
I think that's a philosophical question that is, in a sense, unanswerable. It's your perspective. So-called realist scholars uh, say that we're in a constant state of war, that the world is anarchic, that is, that there's no supreme authority, and so it's a you know there's always potential for war. More liberal-minded people, on the other hand, say the opposite. They say, "What are you talking about? The natural state is one of peace. That yes, wars happen, but it certainly isn't."
But Ian, you study history, right? What do you think? Like, is peace a respite from war, or is it the other way around?
Probably the closest thing I come to it is I have been uh, shocked at what people have been prepared to do to other people in times of war. I mean, maybe I'm a little less shocked now, but there is not much that is glamorous about war, uh, and the suffering that so many people have to endure is really is just is awful. It really is awful.
Or the people who are involved, do they just get carried away? Is it the lawlessness? And it seems like these soldiers that do these things are not doing that back home. All of a sudden they're in war and it's like anything goes.
I don't think it is always just lawlessness. I think it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the war. It depends on the belligerents. In some wars, and for instance, I can think of maybe Yugoslavia. A lot of the time, uh, people have been recruited on the basis that they could basically that there were essentially no rules and that they could profit from it materially, or that there was rape and pillage, and that's why that was allowed to happen. I don't think that's always the case. I think leadership is central to preventing that from happening, and I don't think it always does happen. The whole thing about a military is that it's supposed to be disciplined, um,
Right.
but obviously that's in varying degrees, depending on the nature of the war. I mean, there is an argument which says that that wars actually aren't about differences in identity, uh, and that the only reason why people will go to war is because they can profit from it materially. So this is an argument that's been made by a guy named Paul Collier. Uh, it's called the greed explanation for war. It's also been an argument that's made by a guy named John Mueller, who says that really, in fact, they both make the case that wars are stoppable precisely because the belligerents are in it just for material gain, and that they're really cowards who will stop what they're doing at the first show of force. And therefore, all the international community needs to do is step in, show some force, show some discipline, stand up to these goons, and war will stop.
Do
Um,
you think that would happen?
well, again, it's a sort of philosophical argument that's made, uh, and it probably depends on um, the nature of the war. I do sometimes think it's a bit overstated. I think a lot of the time people really do see conflicts in ethnic terms or in identity terms.
Are countries held accountable for wrongdoing?
Sometimes they are. I think,
Is it really even possible though? Like, how do you can hold a person accountable. There are punishments. How do you hold a country accountable for anything?
well, you said earlier about victors writing history. Sometimes victors also, depending on the nature of the conflict, hold the belligerents accountable. Of course, there was the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Even South Africa, in the post-apartheid era after 1994, the white minority, the National Party, didn't lose this conflict. The circumstances were such that they were willing to move forward with a transition to black majority rule. But I think if they understood that they would, in the immediate aftermath of the transition to black majority rule, that they would be subject to criminal prosecution, there's no way that they would have uh, moved ahead um, with the transition to black majority rule.
But isn't prosecution and aren't these trials so rare? I mean, like the Russia-Ukraine thing. It's the same thing. I mean, they always do something like, well, we're just gonna shove 100 sanctions on you and this and that. But like, I mean, who is being held accountable?
Well, that war's not over. So we'll see what happens. I suspect, I'm not sure, I don't think it's actually going to happen. Uh, but there's no, it seems highly unlikely that Vladimir Putin uh, would be held accountable if he's the number one perpetrator. Nonetheless, people still do talk about it. Maybe another example is what's just happened yesterday with the court identifying the leaders of Hamas uh, and um, and Israel as as having committed war crimes. I mean, even Joe Biden was saying yesterday, or the day before, there's no way that Netanyahu would ever be held uh, accountable, and of course, and the same thing with Israel itself. So yeah, it's I suppose it's true that people don't always aren't always accountable, but that's the nature of war, is that you claim to be defending yourself, protecting your security, advancing your security, and therefore that justifies that certain violent activities be undertaken.
Do wars unite people?
Yes, they definitely do, or I think they can at least. Uh, there's a famous sociologist and another scholar. His name's Charles Tilly. Another one, Jeffrey Herbst, who makes the case that that wars can actually, for instance, interstate wars between states, can mean that people forget the differences amongst themselves because they need to unite for the sake of defending themselves or for prosecuting a war. So yes, I think definitely it can bring people together. It can mean that people forget about their differences. It's also true, though, that when wars end, uh, new differences can emerge. So there was a long-standing war in the country of Sudan, the African country of Sudan, between, this is simplifying things, but a Christian South that was made up of two groups, the Nuer and the Dinka, and again, at the risk of being a bit crude, an Arab North. Certainly in the South, those two groups were more or less united for the sake of defending themselves against the North. Then a few years ago, they got their independence. So there's now a new country called South Sudan. And almost immediately, the differences between the Nuer and the Dinka led to a new axis of conflict amongst southern groups. So, yeah, the common threat can bring people together, and when that common threat disappears, it can lead to new divisions emerging.
Do you think it's human nature to just want to conquer others?
No, at least I wouldn't put it that way that there's just some sort of a innate uh, aggressiveness uh, to attack or conquer others. Having said that, I do think people want to be secure. And so they will prefer to have a set of um, circumstances where their interests can be protected. And if that means taking over a government or um, making sure that you have someone that's friendly in government, then you'll do that. But I'm not sure. I don't mean to sound too naive here. I'm not persuaded that what that's some sort of universally innate aspect of human nature.
Why has it happened so much in throughout history? Do you think it's going on a conquest about resources?
Yeah, for sure. It can be about resources. It can be about territory. It can be about protection. It can be about borders. It can be about um, making sure that you are uh, secure in your borders. That there's a sort of a territory that will protect you. Water can be a great protection. Uh, a river, a mountain range, any of those things. So, at the very least, you may want to have that kind of security. Um, why? As I think I've explained before, I do think at least on one level, it's about people wanting to be sovereign and focusing on questions of who rules and not being ruled by somebody else. But that sort of manifests itself in a whole bunch of other sort of complex ways.